The wind was a thief in the high desert, stealing the heat from the land and the breath from anything foolish enough to be caught in its grip. It screamed across the mesas, tearing at the gnarled junipers and whipping sand into a frenzy that scoured the very rock. What began as a dry, biting gale after sundown had turned treacherous, spitting first rain, then sleet that froze where it landed. It was a night for predators and ghosts, a night to bolt the door and feed the fire, to thank God for a sturdy roof and 4 solid walls. Silas had the roof and walls, built with his own hands 5 years prior. They were made of rough-hewn pine, chinked with mud and stone, and banked against the granite shoulder of a mountain that broke the worst of the westerlies. It wasn't a home. It was a bulwark against the world. Inside, the only sounds were the hiss and crackle of piñon logs in the stone fireplace and the relentless howl of the storm outside. For 5 years, those had been the only sounds he needed. He sat in a straight-backed chair he'd carved himself, cleaning his Colt Peacemaker with an oiled rag, his movements methodical, unhurried. The lamplight cast long shadows that danced and swayed, making the small cabin feel both like a sanctuary and a cage. Then came a new sound. It was faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind, a frantic scrabbling against the thick timber of his door. Silas froze, his hand stilling on the cold steel of the revolver. Nothing came to this place. In 5 years, not a single soul had troubled his solitude. A lost prospector, perhaps, or a sick animal. He set the gun down, its parts laid out neatly on the table, and picked up the Spencer rifle leaning against the wall. He didn't bother with the lamp. He moved through the familiar darkness of the cabin with a predator's grace, his worn boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. The knocking came again, louder this time, a desperate, hammering rhythm that spoke of an energy about to be extinguished. It wasn't the heavy fist of a man. It was lighter, more chaotic. He stood beside the door for a long moment, listening. He heard a sharp intake of breath, a sob caught and choked back, and the sound of a body slumping against the wood. With the rifle held low and ready, he slid the heavy iron bolt. The wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it inward with a deafening crash. A blast of icy air and stinging sleet flooded the cabin, threatening the fire, and framed in the maelstrom of the doorway was a figure, more apparition than human. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20, though the terror in her eyes was ancient. Her dress, a simple calico that might have once been blue, was ripped and caked with mud, clinging to a frame so thin it seemed a strong gust could snap her in two. Her dark hair was plastered to her face and neck, and her feet, bare and blue with cold, were swollen and cut. She wasn't shivering. She was convulsing, her body seized by a violent tremor that seemed to be shaking her apart from the inside out. She stared at him, her eyes wide and dark in a face pale as bone, and for a moment, neither of them moved. She was looking not at a man, but at a final, desperate chance. He saw the fight in her flicker and die, replaced by a wave of exhaustion so profound that her knees buckled. She pitched forward, but he was faster. He dropped the rifle and caught her, his arm hooking around her waist. She weighed next to nothing. Her skin was like ice. Her lips moved, but the only sound was a dry, rasping breath. She tried again, forcing the words out from a place of raw will. "Just one night," she whispered, the sound a fragile thread in the storm's roar. "I'll be gone by morning." Silas looked down at her, his face an unreadable mask of hard lines and shadow. He saw the geography of her flight written on her body, the scratches from thorny brush on her arms, the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, the raw skin on her wrists. He looked past her, out into the screaming blackness from which she had emerged, and saw nothing but wind and fury. He gave a single, sharp nod. He kicked the door shut, the wood groaning in protest, and threw the bolt home. The cabin was plunged back into a world of firelight and shadow. The storm once more, a caged beast raging outside the walls. He lifted her as if she were a child and carried her to the hearth. He didn't lay her on his cot. He set her down gently on the bearskin rug before the fire, her back resting against a pile of furs he used for a pillow. Her head lolled to the side, her eyes fluttering closed. For a long moment, he simply stood over her, a mountain of a man, silent and still. He was not a man given to mercy. The mountains had taught him that mercy was a weakness, a luxury that got you killed. But this was something else. This wasn't a plea for pity. It was a demand for sanctuary, made by a creature who had nothing left to bargain with except her last breath. He turned away from her and crossed to a wooden chest at the foot of his cot. From it, he pulled a heavy wool blanket, thick and coarse, smelling of wood smoke and pine. He returned to her side and draped it over her trembling body, tucking it carefully around her shoulders and feet. He worked with a strange gentleness, his large, calloused hands moving with an efficiency that was almost tender. She flinched when his fingers brushed her ankle, a sharp, reflexive jerk, and her eyes shot open, wide with a familiar terror. He pulled his hand back immediately, raising it slightly in a gesture that was universally understood. No harm. He held her gaze for a beat, his own eyes dark and unreadable, before he stood and moved back to the fireplace. He took up the iron poker and stirred the embers, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The fire roared back to life. He added 2 thick logs of cedar, placing them with practiced care. He didn't speak. He didn't ask her name, or where she came from, or who she was running from. The questions hung in the air, unspoken and unanswered. Her presence was a question in itself, a disruption to the hard-won, silent peace of his existence. He filled a tin cup with water from a bucket by the door and set it on the hearth to warm. He pulled his chair closer to the fire, but angled it away from her, giving her a small illusion of privacy while keeping her in his periphery. He picked up the pieces of his colt and began to reassemble it, his movements sure and economical. Click, snap, whir. The sounds were solid, mechanical, a counterpoint to the wild symphony of the storm. The girl, Eliza, watched him through slitted, heavy eyelids. The warmth of the fire was a physical thing, a slow, creeping miracle that pushed back the deep, aching cold in her bones. It was the first real warmth she'd felt in what felt like a lifetime. She watched his hands. They were big, scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who worked, who fought, who survived. They were the hands that had caught her, that had covered her, and that were now reassembling a weapon with lethal precision. There was no softness in him, none at all, but there was a stillness, a solidity that felt more trustworthy than any gentle word or easy smile she had ever known. The men who had owned her, the men she was running from, they smiled. Their words were slick with promises that turned to threats, their touch soft before it became brutal. This man was different. He was like the rock of the mountain outside, hard, weathered, and unmoving. He had not offered comfort, but he had given her fire. He had not offered kindness, but he had given her shelter in her world. Those were things of far greater value. The water in the cup began to steam. He nudged it closer to her with the toe of his boot. She didn't have the strength to reach for it. He watched her for a moment, then sighed. A quiet exhalation of air. He set the reassembled colt on the table, leaned forward, and picked up the cup. He knelt beside her, the movement stiff. "Drink," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. He held the cup to her lips. She drank, the hot water scalding her throat but sending a wave of life through her. He held it steady until the cup was empty, then set it back on the hearth. He retreated to his chair without another word. The warmth, the water, the sheer, unbelievable fact of being still and safe began to pull her under. Her body, pushed far beyond its limits, was shutting down. Her shivering subsided into a fine tremor. The sounds of the cabin, the fire, the man's quiet breathing, the rhythmic scrape of a knife as he began carving a piece of wood wove themselves into the roar of the wind, becoming a strange, discordant lullaby. She wrapped her arms around herself beneath the blanket, her body curling into a tight knot, the instinctive posture of self-preservation. For the first time in days, she closed her eyes without the fear of what she would see in the darkness. Sleep took her swiftly, a deep, dreamless plunge into oblivion. Silas did not carve for long. He laid the knife and the half-finished figure of a hawk aside. He sat in his chair and watched her sleep. The firelight softened the hard lines of her face, washing away some of the terror and exhaustion, revealing the youth she had nearly lost. He saw the flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat, a fragile, steady beat. He saw the way her hand was clenched into a fist, even in sleep. He rose and added one more log to the fire, enough to last till dawn. He checked the bolt on the door, tested the shutter on the single window. He picked up his rifle, the cold weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hands. But he did not return to his chair. Instead, he moved it, placing it directly in front of the door, blocking it completely. He sat down, the Spencer laid across his lap, his back to the sleeping girl, and faced the entrance to his sanctuary. His gaze was fixed on the stout wood, his ears tuned to the sounds of the night. The girl had bargained for one night. A storm had brought her to his door. But Silas knew storms. He knew they could pass, or they could settle in. And he knew that the kind of storm that chased a barefoot girl across the desert in the dead of winter was not the kind that respected the coming of the dawn. He would see the morning, and so would she. He settled in for the long watch, a silent, solitary guardian against the world. He did not sleep. The sleep that took Eliza was not gentle. It was a dark, heavy tide that dragged her down into its depths, a surrender born of utter depletion. She lay curled on the bearskin rug, a small, still form wrapped in the heavy wool of Silas's blanket. For the first hour, her body remained a knot of tension, her limbs drawn in tight as if to protect her core. A low whimper escaped her lips now and then, a phantom echo of the pain and terror that had chased her here. Her brows would furrow, her fingers clenching the rough fabric of the blanket as unseen specters pursued her through the landscape of her dreams. From his chair by the door, Silas watched. He did not move. The Spencer rifle rested across his thighs, its wooden stock smooth and familiar against his worn denim trousers. His posture was not one of rest, but of readiness, a coiled stillness that seemed to absorb the silence of the room. His eyes, accustomed to the vast, empty distances of the plains and the subtle shifts of light in deep canyons, were fixed on the door. But his awareness encompassed the entire cabin. He was a creature of the wild brought indoors, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He heard the scuttling of a mouse in the thatch, the shift of the logs as they settled in the fire, and the soft, uneven rhythm of the girl's breathing. The storm raged on, its fury unabated. Sleet rattled against the window's shutter like a handful of pebbles thrown by an angry spirit. The wind moaned in the chimney, a mournful, lonely sound that had been the sole companion to his thoughts for 5 years. But tonight, it was different. It was no longer the sound of his own isolation. It was the sound of the world he had shut out, a world that had just thrown one of its broken pieces at his feet. Slowly, as the hours crept by, a change came over the sleeping girl. The profound, bone-deep warmth from the hearth worked its way into her, loosening the tight bands of fear and cold. Her breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady cadence of true rest. Her body began to uncurl, her legs stretching out, her hands unclenching. One arm slipped from beneath the blanket, the back of her hand resting on the dark fur of the rug. Silas's gaze shifted from the door to that hand. In the flickering firelight, he could see it clearly. It was a young hand, slender and fine-boned, but it was not the soft, unblemished hand of a lady. The nails were broken, and the skin was chafed and raw around the wrist. He stared at the mark for a long time. It was a dark, angry red, a bracelet of abraded flesh. He had seen marks like it before, on cattle that fought the rope, on horses that fought the bit, on men who fought the hangman's noose. It was the mark of a cruel and binding restraint, worn for too long and fought against with desperate strength. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle hardening of the muscles along his cheek. He looked away, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the cabin before returning to the door. He was a man who had built his life on the principle of non-interference. He did not meddle in the affairs of others, and he did not allow them to meddle in his. It was a simple, clean code that had kept him alive. But the girl on his floor was not an affair. She was a fact. Her injuries were facts. The terror that clung to her like a second skin was a fact. And the men who had left those marks, men who were surely still out there, were a fact he might soon have to contend with. Around what he judged to be the 3rd hour past midnight, the fire began to die down. The glowing heart of the logs turning to ash, the temperature in the cabin dropped. Eliza stirred in her sleep, a shiver running through her, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Silas rose from his chair. He moved with a liquid silence that belied his size, his footsteps making no sound on the packed earth. He took 2 logs from the woodpile beside the hearth and placed them carefully onto the embers. He used the poker to arrange them, coaxing the flames to lick at the fresh wood. He did not look at her as he worked, affording her the dignity of being unobserved in her vulnerability. Once the fire was strong again, casting its warm, golden light across the room, he retreated to his post. He settled back into the chair, the rifle once more across his lap. His gaze fell upon her feet, which had slipped from the bottom of the blanket. They were a testament to her ordeal, caked in drying mud. They were swollen and discolored, a patchwork of angry red and deep purple. The soles were a ruin of blisters and cuts, some fresh, some already festering. He knew this land. He knew the sharp edges of the shale, the bite of the thorned scrub, the unforgiving nature of the high desert terrain. To have crossed any part of it barefoot was an act of almost unimaginable desperation. He imagined the pain, the relentless, grinding agony of every single step. A grim line formed on his lips. She had not been running. She had been clawing her way toward any chance of survival, one excruciating step at a time. His eyes traveled up, tracing the lines of her form beneath the blanket. She was thin, but there was a resilience in the curve of her hip, in the strength of her shoulder. This was not a woman who broke easily. She bent, she bled, she suffered, but she did not break. He saw it in the stubborn set of her jaw, visible even in the soft repose of sleep, and he saw it in her face. He had only seen her for a moment in the light, her features contorted by fear and exhaustion. Now, with her face relaxed, he could truly see her. Her hair, beginning to dry in the fire's heat, was the color of dark soil, thick and waving around a face that was heart-shaped and pale. Her lashes were long and dark against her skin, a smattering of freckles, almost invisible beneath the grime, dusted her nose. She was young, younger than he had first thought, but it was her eyes, even closed, that held his attention. The skin around them was shadowed with a weariness that had nothing to do with her recent flight. It was an old weariness, a knowledge of the world's harshness that no one her age should possess. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and had learned the hard lesson that hope was a dangerous thing to carry. A log popped in the fireplace, sending a spray of embers up the chimney. The sudden noise caused her to start. Her eyes flew open, but they were unfocused, looking at something in her memory. Not at the cabin. A single, crystalline tear welled and traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "No," she breathed, the word so soft it was barely a sound. "Please, not her." Her eyes closed again, and she sank back into the depths of sleep, her moment of waking terror passing as quickly as it had come. Silas remained motionless, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. The whispered plea hung in the air, a sliver of her story offered up by the unconscious mind. Not her, it was a plea for another, a hint of a grief that ran deeper than her own pain. He had asked for nothing, and she had offered nothing. But the truth had a way of leaking out in the dark, in the quiet moments between breaths. The storm began to lose its battle with the mountain. The wind's scream softened to a low moan, and the sleet turned to a gentle, persistent rain. The world outside was slowly quieting. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the girl's steady breathing. The night had passed its violent peak. As the first pale gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the window shutter, filtering the darkness into shades of charcoal and pewter, Silas did not relax. Dawn was the most dangerous time. It was the time for trackers, the time when a night's worth of prints were fresh and clear on the damp ground. He leaned forward slightly, his ears straining, listening for the one sound that would change everything, the jingle of a bridle, the soft thud of a horse's hoof on wet earth, the low murmur of a man's voice. But there was nothing, only the dripping of water from the eaves and the sigh of the wind in the pines. He looked over at the girl one last time. She was sleeping soundly now, her face turned toward the fire, the tear track on her cheek the only evidence of her brief disturbance. The blanket rose and fell with each deep breath. She had asked for one night. He had given it to her. He had stood guard over her sleep, a silent, unbidden protector. He had watched her, not with pity, but with a kind of grim, reluctant recognition. He recognized the will to survive, the refusal to be broken. It was a language he knew well. It was the only language the mountains ever spoke. The night was over. His watch was done. But as he looked at the raw wounds on her feet and the memory of the plea on her lips, he knew that the trouble, like the slow-moving dawn, was only just beginning. The first thing to penetrate the deep fog of Eliza's sleep was not a sound, but a smell. It was rich and dark and bitter, the scent of coffee boiling, a smell from a life she barely remembered. It was a smell of quiet mornings, of kitchens, of a world that was not running. For a moment, she clung to it, her mind still adrift in the dark, peaceful waters of oblivion. Then came the second sensation, warmth, a steady, penetrating warmth that had soaked into her bones and pushed back the icy chill that had been her constant companion. Her eyes fluttered open. The world came into focus slowly. Rough-hewn wooden beams overhead, gray and smoky, the deep dark brown of a bearskin beneath her cheek, and the gentle, pulsing orange glow of a fire in a stone hearth just a few feet away. She was inside. She was warm. She was safe. The realization was so startling, so profoundly alien, that it felt like a dream. Then memory returned. A brutal, physical blow. The chase, the freezing wind, the desperate hammering on a door in the heart of a storm. And the man. Her head snapped up, a jolt of pure adrenaline clearing the last vestiges of sleep. The cabin was small, a single room that was both Spartan and meticulously ordered. A narrow cot was pressed against one wall, its blanket neatly folded. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves holding tins and sacks of flour lined another wall, and by the fire, his back to her, sat the man. He was exactly as she remembered him from the brief, terrifying moments in the doorway, large, still, a silhouette of quiet power against the flames. He hadn't moved from the chair she'd last seen him in, though it was now angled toward the hearth. A tin coffee pot sat on a grate over the embers, bubbling softly. He held a cup in his hands, staring into the fire as if reading a book written in flame and ash. The Spencer rifle was no longer across his lap. It leaned against the wall next to him, within easy reach. The promise she had made, her desperate bargain, echoed in her mind. "I'll be gone by morning." Morning was here. The relentless howling of the wind had subsided, replaced by the steady, drumming patter of rain on the roof. A watery, gray light filtered through a single shuttered window, painting the cabin in shades of silver and slate. Pain shot through her as she tried to move. It was a sharp, comprehensive inventory of her injuries. Her feet felt like 2 blocks of solid fire. Her muscles screamed in protest, and a deep ache radiated from the bruise on her cheek. Every part of her hurt, but it was a pain that meant she was alive. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her breath hissing between her teeth. The heavy wool blanket, smelling of smoke and the clean, sharp scent of pine, pooled around her waist. She had to leave. To stay was to invite danger, not just for herself, but for the man who had, for reasons she could not fathom, given her shelter. Gratitude was a luxury, and she couldn't afford to repay his strange, silent kindness by bringing her hunters to his door. With deliberate, painful slowness, she began to ready herself. She had nothing to pack, nothing to gather. Her preparation was an act of will. She folded the heavy blanket with meticulous care, her hands shaking slightly. It was a small gesture, the only payment she could offer. She placed it neatly on the bearskin rug where she had slept. Then, gritting her teeth against the agony, she forced herself to her feet. She swayed, a wave of dizziness washing over her, and her hand shot out to brace herself against the stone of the hearth. The movement, slight as it was, broke the stillness of the room. Silas did not turn. He simply lifted his head slightly, his attention shifting from the fire to her reflection, faint and distorted, in the soot-stained glass of the lantern on the mantelpiece. He had been aware of her stirring for some time. He had heard the shift in her breathing, the soft rustle of the blanket. Eliza took a steadying breath. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, hoarse whisper, raw from disuse and the cold. "I'll be leaving now," she said, the words feeling fragile and inadequate in the quiet space. "Thank you." The man remained silent for a long moment. The only sounds were the rain and the crackle of the fire. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't acknowledge her thanks. He didn't acknowledge her statement at all. Instead, he lifted his chin, his gaze directed toward the shuttered window, as if he could see right through the wood. "Rain hasn't quit," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks settling deep in the earth. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a simple statement of fact. He paused, then added, "You could wait." The words hung in the air between them. You could wait. He didn't say you should or you must. He offered her a choice, a possibility she hadn't considered. Every instinct she possessed, every lesson learned from a short, brutal life, screamed at her to refuse, to run, to never be indebted to anyone, especially a man whose face she had barely seen. Trust was a fool's game, and she had played it once and lost everything. But her body betrayed her. Her legs trembled with weakness, and the thought of stepping out into that cold, relentless rain, of feeling the sharp rocks and sodden earth under her ruined feet, was a prospect of such misery that her resolve wavered, as if he knew the war being waged within her. Silas moved. He reached for a second tin cup sitting on the hearth, and with a steady hand, he poured it full from the pot. The rich, dark aroma filled the small cabin. He stood, and for the first time, turned to face her fully. He was taller than she'd realized, broad-shouldered and lean. His face was all harsh angles and weathered lines, carved by sun and wind and solitude. A short, dark beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, deep set beneath a heavy brow, were the color of a stormy sky. They held no pity, no curiosity, no warmth. They were the eyes of a watcher, a man who saw everything and revealed nothing. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her torn dress, her bare feet, her defiant posture. And then he looked away. He walked to the table, placed the cup of coffee near the empty chair, and then returned to his own seat by the fire. He had not said another word. He simply made the offer and left the decision to her. Eliza stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the stone of the hearth. She stared at the steaming cup. It was a tether, an anchor in the storm of her fear. No one had ever offered her something so simple, so freely. In her life, every gesture from a man came with a price tag attached, a debt to be paid. They asked her name so they could own it. They offered a meal so they could claim a service. They gave shelter so they could possess the person within it. This man had asked for nothing. He had not even asked her name. He had demanded no story, no explanation, no promise. He just offered coffee. Her legs made the decision for her, with a slow, limping gait. She crossed the short distance to the table. Each step was a fresh agony, but she did not make a sound. She lowered herself carefully into the chair, her body protesting with a chorus of aches. She wrapped her cold, trembling hands around the hot tin cup. The heat was a shock, real and immediate. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The coffee was black and brutally strong, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was warmth and life and a moment's respite. She drank it slowly, letting the heat spread through her chest, a small, defiant flame against the cold fear that lived there permanently. They sat in silence, separated by the small wooden table. He stared into the fire. She stared into her cup. The rain drummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm on the roof. In the quiet, the unspoken questions felt as loud as shouts. Who are you? Where did you come from? Who is chasing you? Why are you here? But he did not ask. And because he did not ask, she did not have to lie. For the first time in a long time, she could simply be a girl in a cabin, drinking coffee, while the rain fell outside. After a while, Silas rose again. He moved to the shelves and took down a small sack of flour and a slab of bacon wrapped in oilcloth. He worked with an economy of motion, wasting no movement, no thought. He sliced the bacon with a large hunting knife and laid the strips in a heavy iron skillet. Soon, the sound of sizzling fat joined the rhythm of the rain, and a new smell, smoky and savory, filled the cabin. He did not look at her, did not speak. He was simply performing the necessary tasks of the morning. But as he mixed a crude dough for biscuits in a wooden bowl, he was acutely aware of her. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a tangible presence on his back. He had let her stay. He wasn't sure why. It was a violation of the simple rules that had governed his life for 5 years. But to turn her out, barefoot and injured, into that weather, even his hardened solitude had a limit. It was not kindness. It was, he told himself, practicality. A dead girl near his cabin would bring questions, and questions brought people. It was easier to just let her wait out the rain. He cooked the biscuits in the skillet after the bacon was done, and when they were golden brown, he slid a portion of the food onto a tin plate. He put the plate on the table in front of her, along with a fork. Then he served himself and sat down opposite her once more. Eliza stared at the food, bacon and biscuits, a simple, hearty meal. It had been days since she had eaten anything more than a few wild berries she'd scavenged. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was painful. But she hesitated. To take his food was to deepen a debt she could never repay. He seemed to understand. He didn't watch her or wait for her to eat. He simply began to eat his own meal, his attention focused on his plate. His implicit permission was all she needed. She picked up the fork, her hand still unsteady, and took a bite. The taste was overwhelming, salty, greasy, warm. It was the taste of survival. She ate slowly at first, then faster, unable to control the desperate, gnawing hunger. She forced herself to slow down, embarrassed by her own ravenousness. When she was finished, she looked up. He had already finished his meal and was sipping his coffee, his gaze once more directed at the fire. He had not rushed her. He had not made her feel like a beggar. He had simply shared his morning meal as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She looked from him, to the sturdy walls of the cabin, and then to the shuttered window where the rain still fell. She had bargained for one night, He had given it to her. Now, he was giving her the morning. She didn't know his name. He didn't know hers, but in the space of a few silent hours, he had offered her something more valuable than any name. He had offered her a moment to catch her breath, and as she cradled the last of the warmth from her coffee cup, she knew she would take it. The world could wait, at least until the rain stopped. The silence that followed the meal was different from the silence of the night. The storm had been a roaring beast outside the walls, a known and simple enemy that made the small, firelit space a sanctuary. But now, with the rain reduced to a whisper and the world outside washed clean and quiet, the silence inside the cabin felt heavier, filled with the unspoken truths of their situation. Eliza sat at the table, nursing the last of the warmth in her tin cup, acutely aware that the rain's end had also ended her excuse for staying. She had to go. The knowledge was a cold stone in her stomach. Every moment she remained, she drew a circle of danger around this place, around this man. She risked repaying his quiet provision with violence. She looked at her feet, propped carefully on the rung of the other chair. The swelling had gone down some, but they were a raw, angry map of her flight. The thought of putting her weight on them, of walking out into the sodden, cold landscape, sent a wave of nausea through her. But the fear of what was behind her was greater than the fear of the pain ahead. Silas seemed to be lost in his own world. He sat by the hearth, sharpening his hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shh-lick of steel on stone, a steady, meditative sound. He worked with an unwavering focus, his hands sure and practiced. He seemed a part of the cabin, as natural and permanent as the stone of the fireplace or the timber of the walls. It was hard to imagine him anywhere else, and harder still to imagine this place without him. He had not spoken a word since they had finished eating, and Eliza found herself studying him, trying to piece together the man from the fragments he offered. His clothes were worn but clean, patched at the elbow and knee with a neat, functional stitch. His hands, though calloused and scarred, were not clumsy. His movements were deliberate, efficient. There was nothing wasted in him. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts. She wondered what had brought him here, to this high, lonely place. What storm had he fled to seek this profound, isolating peace? Her own troubles felt all-consuming, but she recognized in his deep-set eyes a history he did not speak of, a past that had taught him the value of silence and a solid door. The rhythmic scraping of the knife stopped. Silas lifted his head, his body going unnaturally still. He was listening, but not to anything inside the cabin. His gaze was fixed on the shuttered window, his head cocked at an angle. Eliza held her breath, her own senses straining to catch what he had heard. At first, there was nothing but the dripping of water from the eaves. Then she heard it, a frantic, percussive sound, muffled by the wet earth, but growing rapidly closer. Hoofbeats. It was not the steady, measured tread of a rider. It was a wild, panicked drumming, the sound of pure flight. Before Eliza could react, a blur of motion streaked past the cabin's single window. It was a horse, a wild sorrel with a tangled mane and eyes white with terror. It ran with the desperate, lunging gait of a creature running for its life, its hooves kicking up clods of dark, wet soil as it disappeared into the screen of junipers on the far side of the clearing. The breath she had been holding escaped her in a ragged gasp. Her blood ran cold. A horse did not run like that without reason. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Silas was already on his feet. He set the knife and stone on the mantelpiece and moved to the door. There was no hesitation in his movements, only a grim, coiled readiness. He didn't reach for the rifle. Not yet. He simply unbolted the door and stepped outside, leaving it slightly ajar. Eliza scrambled from her chair, ignoring the searing pain in her feet. She limped to the opening, her body trembling, and peered out into the gray, misty morning. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of wet earth and pine. Silas stood in the center of the clearing, his back to her, looking not in the direction the horse had gone, but back the way it had come. He was as still as a granite boulder, his head slowly scanning the landscape. From her vantage point, she could see the tracks. The storm had turned the ground into a soft, muddy canvas, and the sorrel's passage had been recorded with perfect, terrible clarity. The hoof prints were deep, splayed at the edges, the marks of a creature at a full, desperate gallop. Silas took a few slow steps forward, his eyes fixed on the ground. He knelt down, his large frame folding with a surprising grace, and examined a set of tracks that were not the wild horse's. He touched the edge of one of the prints with his forefinger. Eliza could not see what he saw, but she could see the change in him. It was a subtle thing, a tightening of the shoulders, a hardening of the line of his jaw. He remained there for a long moment, a hunter reading a story she could not comprehend. Finally, he stood and turned, his eyes sweeping over the surrounding terrain, the rocky outcrops, the thick stands of pine, the low-lying ravines still shrouded in morning mist. His face was a mask, impassive and unreadable, but Eliza saw a new watchfulness in his gaze, a cold, calculating light that had not been there before. He was no longer just a man in his home. He was a man assessing a threat on his territory. When he walked back toward the cabin, his stride was the same unhurried, deliberate pace as before, but it felt different. It felt heavier. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him and sliding the bolt firmly into place. The sound echoed in the quiet room, a definitive, metallic thud. Eliza backed away from the door, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She knew. She didn't need him to say a word. The terror was a living thing inside her now, coiling in her gut. They were close. Her hunters were close. They had driven that horse before them, and they would not give up. "The rain has stopped," she said, her voice thin and reedy. I should go. I need to go." She began to move toward the bearskin rug where her blanket lay, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Her plan was madness. She could barely walk. She had no food, no weapon, no destination except away. But the instinct to flee was overpowering, a primal command that superseded all logic. To stay was to be trapped. Silas watched her, his expression unchanged. He walked past her to the fireplace and picked up the tin coffee pot, testing its weight. He seemed to be considering her words, or perhaps ignoring them entirely. "I brought you trouble," she whispered, her voice cracking. She stopped and faced him, a desperate plea in her eyes. "I'm sorry. You gave me shelter. I can't let them find me here. It's not your fight." He finally looked at her. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of his attention. Those stormy gray eyes pinned her in place, seeing past her fear, past her desperation, to the core of the situation. He had read the story in the mud, and he understood it better than she did. He saw the shod hooves of 3 horses, riding hard, their weight and pace indicating determined men. He saw their direction, a straight line that would eventually bring them right past this secluded shelf on the mountainside. He saw how fresh the tracks were, how the water had not yet begun to pool in them. He knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that to let her leave now would be to send her walking straight into the arms of her pursuers. She would not last an hour. He set the coffee pot down on the hearth. He took a step toward her, closing the small distance between them. She flinched, expecting anger, expecting to be thrown out into the cold, but he simply stood there, a bulwark between her and the door. "They're close," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't stay." He looked down at her pale, terrified face and her hopelessly injured feet. He saw the wild, frantic energy in her, the same panic he had seen in the eyes of the sorrel horse, and in that moment, he made a decision. The rules of his solitude were broken. The line had been crossed. He spoke, and his voice was not harsh, but it held a quality of command that was as solid and unyielding as the mountain at his back. "You're not going anywhere today. His words were not a negotiation. They were a verdict. "You're not going anywhere today." The sentence settled in the small cabin, as final and immovable as the mountain itself. For a wild, panicked moment, Eliza wanted to argue, to scream, to beat her fists against the door, but the futility of it was overwhelming. She was weak, injured, and he was a wall of quiet certainty. Arguing with him would be like arguing with the storm. So she did nothing. She watched as he moved, a prisoner observing her warden. But he did not act like a warden. He simply went about the business of the day as if her presence were a normal, if inconvenient, fact. He took the heavy iron skillet, scrubbed it clean with sand and water from a bucket, and hung it back on its hook. He swept the packed earth floor with a makeshift broom of bound twigs. He did these things with a focused, unhurried rhythm that was both calming and deeply unsettling. He was a man utterly at home in his solitude, and she was an intruder in his carefully constructed world. She retreated to the chair at the table, the one she had occupied for breakfast, and made herself small. It became her island in the small sea of the cabin. To move from it felt like a transgression. She drew her legs up, wrapping her arms around her knees, and watched him. After his morning chores were done, Silas took his Spencer rifle from its place against the wall. He sat in his own chair by the hearth and, with the same methodical precision he'd shown with his revolver the night before, he began to clean it. He laid a piece of oilcloth on the floor and carefully disassembled the weapon, its metal parts clicking softly in the quiet room. He worked with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity, his hands moving over the stock and barrel as if they were the limbs of a trusted animal. Eliza watched his hands. She had watched them build a fire, reassemble a pistol, pour coffee, and now care for a rifle. They were capable of immense gentleness and lethal efficiency. The sight of the powerful weapon being stripped and cleaned should have frightened her. The men she knew handled guns with a boisterous, threatening energy, using them to intimidate and control. But Silas's movements were different. They were respectful, practical. The rifle was not a symbol of power. It was a tool, like his axe or his knife, and he was simply ensuring it was in good working order. The quiet care he took was, in its own way, more menacing than any loud threat. It was the work of a man who did not make idle gestures, a man who expected his tools to function when called upon. The hours of the day stretched, long and silent. The drumming of the rain ceased, leaving behind a world of dripping trees and damp. Heavy air, sunlight thin and watery, struggled through the clouds, casting a pale, cheerless light into the cabin. The silence was a living thing, a third presence in the room. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of things unsaid, questions unasked, and the palpable, vibrating tension of the hunt outside. At one point, Eliza noticed a fresh tear in the sleeve of her calico dress, a long rip she'd gotten scrambling through a thicket of thorns. On impulse, driven by a desperate need to do something, anything, with her hands, she looked at Silas. "Do you have a needle and thread?" she asked, her voice startlingly loud in the stillness. He paused in his work, his hands stilling on the rifle's trigger assembly. He looked at her, his eyes holding hers for a beat longer than usual. It was a simple request, a domestic one, and it felt strangely out of place in the charged atmosphere. He gave a single, curt nod. He rose, walked to a small wooden chest at the foot of his cot, and opened it. The interior was as neat as the rest of the cabin. He rummaged for a moment and came back with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table in front of her chair and returned to his work without a word. Inside the bundle was a spool of thick, dark thread, a few sturdy needles, and a small, smooth stone for a thimble, tools for mending canvas and leather. Not fine calico, but they would do. With trembling fingers, she threaded a needle and began to stitch the tear in her sleeve. The simple, repetitive motion of pulling the thread through the cloth was a comfort. It was a small act of repair in a world that felt utterly broken. It gave her a focus, a reason to look down and not at the silent man by the fire, not at the bolted door, not at the terrifying, unknown landscape outside the window. Silas finished with the rifle. He reassembled it, tested its action with a satisfying snick, and leaned it back in its place. He then pulled on a heavy sheepskin coat and, without a glance in her direction, unbolted the door and stepped outside. Panic flared in Eliza's chest, hot and swift. He was leaving. He was leaving her alone. The door was ajar, an invitation for her to run or for the world to come rushing in. She sat frozen, the needle clutched in her fingers, her heart hammering. She listened, every nerve ending alive with fear, for the sound of his footsteps fading away. But they didn't. She heard the rhythmic, solid thump, thwack of an axe biting into wood. Not far from the cabin, he was chopping firewood. He hadn't abandoned her. He was simply continuing his day. The realization settled her, but the fear was replaced by a profound sense of bewilderment. He was laying in supplies. He was preparing for the night, for a night that she was, apparently, going to be a part of. The day he had granted her was bleeding into the evening. He was not gone long. He returned with an armload of split pine, which he stacked neatly by the hearth. He brought the cold, clean scent of the outdoors with him, the smell of wet pine needles and damp earth. He bolted the door again and went back to his chair, picking up the small piece of wood he had been carving the night before. The knife began to move again, peeling away thin, fragrant curls of wood, slowly revealing the shape of a hawk in flight. As the pale afternoon light began to fade, the sky grew dark again, the clouds thickening into a bruised, purple-black canopy. The temperature dropped sharply. A new sound began, a tentative tapping on the roof, different from the soft drumming of the rain. It grew louder, more insistent, until it became a hard, frantic rattle. Hail. The stones were small at first, like scattered pebbles, but they grew in size and intensity, hammering against the roof and the wooden window shutter with a violent, deafening rhythm. It sounded as if a dozen angry men were throwing handfuls of rocks at the cabin. The world outside was being scoured, punished by the falling ice. The fire in the hearth was beginning to burn low, its light a small, defiant flicker against the growing gloom and the roar of the hailstorm. The day was over. Her reprieve was over. The bargain had been for one night. He had extended it through one day, but another night was falling, a night far more violent than the last. She looked at him. He was still carving, his face cast in shadow, the knife moving with hypnotic calm, a small island of peace in the heart of the storm's fury. She had to ask, the thought of being sent out into that, of facing that icy onslaught with her ruined feet, was a terror that eclipsed even the fear of her pursuers. She swallowed, her throat dry. She whispered the words, so quiet they were almost lost in the din of the hail. Just one more night. The knife in Silas's hand stopped moving. He did not look at her. He sat perfectly still for a long count of 10, the only movement the slow rise and fall of his chest. The hail hammered against the roof, each impact a punctuation mark in the heavy silence between them. He had every right to say no. She was a danger, a complication, a ghost who had wandered out of the storm and into his life. He owed her nothing more. Then he moved. He placed the half-finished carving and his knife carefully on the mantelpiece. He stood, his large frame unfolding from the chair. He turned and his eyes met hers across the darkening room. There was no anger in them, no impatience. There was only a deep, weary gravity, an acceptance of a thing that could not be changed. He walked to the woodpile, saw that it was diminished. He went to the door, slid the heavy bolt, and pulled it open, and blast of frigid air and a clatter of ice pellets swept into the cabin. Without a word, he stepped out into the raging hailstorm. Eliza stared, aghast. She could hear the sharp, painful impacts of the ice against the wood of the cabin. She could only imagine what they felt like against flesh. Through the open door, she saw him walk, unhurried, to the larger woodpile stacked against the cabin's outer wall. He did not shield his head. He simply endured it. He gathered a massive armload of wood, far more than he had brought in earlier, and carried it back inside, his coat and hat already white with accumulated ice. He dropped the wood by the hearth with a resounding crash, then shut and bolted the door, plunging them back into their isolated world. He shook the ice from his hat and shrugged off his coat. He did not look at her. He knelt before the hearth and began to build up the fire. He didn't just add a log or two. He restructured the entire pyre, laying a solid foundation of large logs that would burn slow and hot, creating a deep, enduring bed of coals. He added smaller pieces on top, coaxing the flames until the fire was no longer a flicker, but a roaring, hungry blaze that filled the cabin with a fierce, golden light and a radiating heat. It was a fire built not just for a few hours, but to wage war against a long, bitter night. When he was satisfied, he stood and walked not to his chair, but to the wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it and took out a dark brown bottle and 2 tin cups. He brought them to the table. He uncorked the bottle and poured a measure of amber liquid into each cup. The sharp, medicinal scent of whiskey cut through the smell of wood smoke. He pushed 1 cup across the table toward her. Then he turned to the narrow cot against the wall. It was his bed, his private space. He had a simple mattress stuffed with straw and a single, coarse wool blanket. He looked at it for a moment, then began to arrange it. He smoothed the existing blanket with a slow, deliberate motion. Then he reached back into the chest and pulled out a second blanket, one she hadn't seen before. It was older, softer, its edges frayed. He unfolded it and laid it carefully on the cot, next to the other. He did not offer her the bed. He simply prepared it for two separate blankets on a single narrow cot. He had not spoken a single word in response to her plea. He had not needed to. The roaring fire that defied the storm, the shared drink that acknowledged their grim reality, the second blanket that offered a space beyond the floor. Each action was a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter in a story he would never speak aloud. The bargain had been for one night. That was the currency of a desperate stranger. But the storm had returned, and the rules had changed. Tonight was not a bargain. It was an understanding. Outside, the hail fell like judgment from a merciless sky. Inside, the fire roared, and 2 cups of whiskey sat on the table, waiting. The whiskey was a shock, a trail of liquid fire down her throat that landed like a hot coal in the pit of her stomach. It did not warm her. It scoured her, burning away the numbness that had been her only shield. She choked back a cough, her eyes watering, and looked across the table at Silas. He drank his own portion in a single, steady swallow, his expression unchanging, as if he were drinking water. He set the cup down with a soft metallic click. Outside, the hail fell with the fury of a biblical plague, a relentless, deafening assault that erased the world. The cabin, lit by the roaring fire, felt like the last solid place on earth, a tiny, fragile bubble of warmth and light in an ocean of violent chaos. In here, there was only the fire, the storm, and the silent man whose name she did not know. She took another sip of the whiskey. This time, the fire was less a shock and more a slow, spreading heat. It crept through her veins, loosening the knots of terror and grief that had been cinched tight for days, for months, for years. The simple, repetitive stitches on her sleeve, the food in her belly, the solid chair beneath her, the impossible fact of the second blanket on the cot. It was all too much. The careful walls she had built around her memories began to crumble. "His name is Jebediah Thorne," she said. The words fell into the roaring silence, small and sharp. Silas stopped moving. He had been turning his empty cup in his hands, but now his fingers went still. He did not look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the fire, his profile a hard, unreadable silhouette against the flames. His stillness was an invitation, an assurance that he would not interrupt the story that was about to break free. "He owns a mine, silver, north of the San Juan Range." Her voice was a monotone, a recitation of facts she had pushed down so far they had almost petrified. "My father, he owed men. He made a bargain, sent me and my sister, Sarah, to Thorne, to work in his house, to settle the debt." She stared down at her hands, at the needle still threaded, resting on the rough calico. She remembered her father's face that day, hollowed out by shame and desperation, and the way he couldn't meet their eyes. A bargain. That was the clean, simple word for a dirty, complicated thing. They were not workers. They were property, as much as Thorne's horses or the ore pulled from the ground. Thorne. He was a quiet man. Never shouted. He didn't need to. He had a way of looking at you that made your skin cold. He liked things orderly. He liked things that were his. She paused, the whiskey burning in her chest. Sarah. She wasn't orderly. She was like a wild hawk. She had a fire in her. She wasn't afraid of him. I was. This was the heart of it, the shame that fueled her flight as much as the fear. She had always been the quiet one, the one who endured, who made herself small and invisible to avoid notice. Sarah had been the one who took the risks, who spoke back, who bore the brunt of Thorne's quiet displeasure to shield her younger sister. He wanted things from me, things a husband takes. But he was not my husband. He just owned the paper that said he was. She looked up, her eyes pleading with the silent man across from her, begging him to understand the nuances of a horror that had no name. Sarah saw it. She saw the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. She started getting in the way, always there, always finding a reason for me to be somewhere else. She put herself between us. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of embers up the chimney. The hail on the roof was a relentless, angry drumbeat, the soundtrack to her memory. One evening, Thorne had been drinking. He came into the kitchen. He told me to come with him. Sarah was there. She told him to leave me be. She stood in front of me. He laughed. It was a soft sound, ugly. He said he was tired of her interference. He said he would teach her a lesson about what belonged to him. Her voice broke. A single tear, hot as the whiskey, slid down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. He grabbed her arm. She fought him. She was strong. She raked her nails across his face. No one had ever dared to touch him. For a second, he looked surprised. Then his eyes went flat, like a snake's. He pushed her, hard. We were at the top of the cellar stairs. She fell. The sound. Eliza's breath hitched, a dry, ragged sob. It was the sound of something breaking, something that could never be fixed. She fell silent. The memory was complete. A perfect, terrible image burned into her mind her sister, a crumpled shape in the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, and Jebediah Thorne, standing at the top, looking down, his face a mask of cold fury with 4 red lines etched into his cheek. He had looked not at Sarah, but at Eliza. He had looked at his witness. He told the other servants she had tripped. He said it was a tragic accident. No one questioned him. They were too afraid. But he knew I saw. He knew I knew. After that, the way he looked at me changed. There was no more pretense. Just waiting. He was waiting for the right time. I knew I couldn't stay. I knew what would happen to me. Not just what he wanted, but that he would never let a witness live. So I ran. I just ran. She finished. The story was out. A poison drawn from a deep wound. She was empty, hollowed out. She felt a profound, aching exhaustion, a weariness that went deeper than bone. She expected him to say something, to offer a word of pity, of disbelief, of judgment. She expected him to tell her to leave, to take her deadly story far away from his door. Silas did none of these things. He remained perfectly still for a long time, his back to her, watching the fire. The flames danced in his dark, unreadable eyes. Her story had dropped a stone into the deep, quiet well of his solitude, and he was listening to the ripples. He had his own ghosts, his own memories of violence and injustice. He had seen what powerful men did to those they considered weak. He had seen the flat, cold eyes of a killer. He did not need to see Jebediah Thorne to know him. He knew the breed. Slowly, as if his limbs were heavy, he stood. He picked up the bottle of whiskey and poured another measure into his cup. He did not offer her more. He walked to his cot and stood over it, looking down at the two blankets. Then he turned and looked at her. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his chin, a small, almost imperceptible gesture toward the bed. It was not a command. It was a concession. The story had taken the last of her strength. She could barely stand. She limped to the cot, her body screaming with a pain that was now a dull, distant echo of her grief. She lay down on the outer edge, on top of the second, softer blanket. She did not undress. She curled into a tight ball, facing the wall, her back to him and to the room. She closed her eyes, and the darkness that took her was absolute, a bottomless, dreamless void. Silas watched until her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. He drank his whiskey. He stoked the fire one last time, ensuring it would burn hot and bright through the long, violent night. He did not take the other space on the cot. Instead, he pulled his chair away from the fire and placed it near the foot of the bed, positioning it so he could see both the sleeping girl and the bolted door. He sat down, the Spencer rifle across his lap, and began his watch. The hail beat against the cabin, but inside, all was quiet. He had heard her truth. Now, he would stand guard over it. The dawn broke clear and achingly cold. The world outside was encased in a brittle, sparkling layer of ice. Eliza woke slowly, feeling the unfamiliar softness of the blanket beneath her. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back. She sat up, her heart pounding. The cabin was filled with a pale, blue light. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, red-gold embers. The chair at the foot of the cot was empty. He was gone. The thought sent a jolt of pure panic through her. But then she saw him. He was sitting at the table. The Spencer rifle was in its usual place, but laid out on a clean oilcloth before him were the pieces of another weapon. It was an old gun, heavier and more powerful than the Peacemaker. A Colt Dragoon, its barrel long and its frame massive, a relic from a harder, bloodier time. It was not a gun a man kept for hunting rabbits. It was a gun a man kept for fighting other men. He was not cleaning it idly. He worked with a cold, focused intensity she had not seen before. He oiled each part until it gleamed in the morning light. He tested the cylinder, the hammer, the trigger, his movements economical and precise. There was a finality to his actions, a grim purpose that sent a chill down her spine. He had heard her story. He had not offered words. He had not promised protection, but as she watched him load the heavy pistol, carefully seating each percussion cap, she understood. He had listened to her truth, and in the cold light of the new day, he was preparing for the war it had invited to his door. He was cleaning his guns. The Colt Dragoon was a heavy, formidable weapon, a piece of ordnance designed for a battlefield. When fully loaded, it felt less like a pistol and more like a block of solid, deadly iron in Silas's hand. He seated the last percussion cap, his thumb pressing it firmly onto the nipple. The click was small, but it resonated in the cold morning air with a terrible finality. He did not put the weapon away. He tucked it, heavy and cold, into the waistband of his trousers at the small of his back, the worn sheepskin of his coat hiding it from view. Eliza watched him from the cot, her hands clutching the soft blanket. She had not moved. The story she had told in the dark, whispered into the heart of a hailstorm, had been a release of poison. Now, in the stark, unforgiving light of morning. That poison felt as if it had seeped into the very air of the cabin, tainting everything. His preparation of the gun was not a comfort, it was a confirmation. Her past was not a ghost, it was a hunting party. And it was coming. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him to stop, to tell him she would leave, that this was not his fight. But the words died in her throat. What could she say? The truth was already told. The consequences were already in motion. It was then that the sound came. It was not the panicked drumming of a fleeing horse or the familiar patter of rain. It was a sharp, unnatural crack, like a branch snapping under a heavy weight. It was the sound of a shod hoof striking a sheet of ice-covered rock. It was followed by another, and then the low, guttural curse of a man. The sounds were distant, but in the crystalline, post-storm stillness of the high country, they traveled with perfect clarity. Silas froze. He hadn't been looking at her, but she felt his awareness shift, his focus snapping from the gun in his hands to the world outside the door. He rose from the table in a single, fluid motion, all the deliberate slowness gone, replaced by an absolute, chilling economy of movement. He crossed to her in 2 long strides. He did not touch her, but he stood over the cot, his presence a shadow that blotted out the morning light. "Get to the far corner," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper that was more command than suggestion. "Away from the window. Stay on the floor. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart. She scrambled off the cot, her injured feet sending lances of pain up her legs, and huddled in the narrow space between the foot of the cot and the stone of the hearth. It was the darkest part of the cabin. She pulled the soft blanket from the bed and wrapped it around herself. A child hiding from monsters in the dark. Silas moved through the cabin, his actions swift and purposeful. He took a half-empty sack of jerky from a shelf and a small tin of coffee. He shoved them into a worn leather satchel, a hunter's game bag. He slung it over his shoulder. He grabbed the Spencer rifle, the long gun, the plausible gun from its place by the wall. He did not look back at her. He simply walked to the door, unbolted it, and stepped outside, pulling it shut behind him. The latch did not click. He left it unsecured. From her hiding place, Eliza could see nothing. Her world had been reduced to a sliver of rough-hewn floorboards and the cold, unyielding stone of the fireplace. Her senses were stretched to a breaking point. She heard the soft crunch of his boots on the ice-crusted ground. She heard the low nicker of a horse, his horse. She realized, which must be kept in a small lean-to she hadn't seen. She heard the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of a bridle, the soft snort of the animal. He was doing exactly what he had to do, creating the illusion of a normal morning. A man, leaving his cabin to go hunting. A man who was alone. Then came the new voices. They were closer now, much closer. "Ho!" The cabin, a man's voice called out, rough and impatient. Eliza pressed herself deeper into the corner, her knuckles white where she clutched the blanket. She held her breath until her lungs burned. She heard the steady, unhurried sound of Silas's horse walking out to meet them, the crunch of 4 hooves, not 3. "Morning," Silas's voice rumbled, calm and even. There was no trace of alarm in it, no hint of the heavy pistol tucked against his spine. "That your place?" the first man asked. His voice was sharp, accustomed to asking questions and getting answers. "It is," Silas replied. "We're looking for someone. Seen a girl pass this way, young, dark hair, on foot." There was a pause. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a deafening drum in her ears. She prayed he would be convincing, that his solitary life had taught him how to lie with a still face. "Haven't seen a soul," Silas said, his voice flat. "Storm kept things quiet. Ground's frozen solid besides. Hard to find tracks." "She came this way," a second voice snarled. This one meaner, edged with a frustrated violence. We've been tracking her for 2 days. That fool storm washed out her trail down in the flats, but she was headed up into these rocks. There's a reward for her." "A reward?" Silas's voice was laced with just the right amount of casual interest. "What's she wanted for?" "She's a runaway," the mean-voiced man said. "Stole something from her employer, Jebediah Thorne. He just wants his property back." The name, Thorne. Hearing it spoken by these men, here, a few yards from where she was hiding, was like having ice water poured down her spine. They were real. They were here. It was not a nightmare from which she could awake. "Jebediah Thorne," Silas repeated, his voice devoid of emotion, as if tasting the name. "Never heard of him." "He's an important man," the first voice cut in. "Taking over again. He sounded like the leader, and he's willing to pay well for information, and pay double for the girl herself. Maybe you saw her last night, before the hail started. A man living alone, he might be tempted to offer a pretty girl shelter." The words were a casual question, but they dripped with insinuation, a veiled threat. "The only thing I offered shelter to last night was my fire," Silas said, his tone turning cold. "If you're calling me a liar, you should do it plain." There was a tense silence. Eliza could picture the scene: the 3 hard-faced riders, their hands near their guns, and the lone, broad-shouldered man on his buckskin, the long rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. A silent, deadly calculation was taking place. The leader seemed to decide it wasn't worth it. "Easy now," he said, his voice losing its edge, becoming falsely friendly. "No offense meant, just trying to cover all the ground. We know she's in these hills. She's hurt, and she's desperate. She can't have gone far." "What did she look like?" Silas asked, his voice returning to its flat, neutral tone. "Like I said, young, maybe 20, dressed in a plain calico dress, probably torn to rags by now. She's a slip of a thing, but she's sly." The man paused. "Pretty, too, in a broken-down sort of way. You'd remember her if you saw her. Name's Eliza." Hearing her own name spoken by her hunter was the most terrifying thing of all. It made her real to them. It made her his. "Can't help you," Silas said again. "I'm heading east, checking my trap lines. Country's rough that way. If she went that direction, the coyotes have probably found her already." "We'll take our chances," the leader said. Then, as if he couldn't resist twisting the knife, he added, "Mister, Thorne is a sentimental man. He was particularly fond of this girl. Her sister had a clumsy accident. You see, fell down some stairs. Tragic. Eliza here. She took it hard. Got confused in her grief. That's why she ran. He's just worried for her. Is all. Wants to make sure she's safe." The lie was so grotesque, so obscene, that Eliza thought she might be sick. She pressed her face into the rough wool of the blanket, biting her lip to keep from making a sound. The man was talking about Sarah's murder as if it were a sad, unfortunate misstep, and he was telling this stranger that Thorne's intentions were protective. "A man has a right to his property," the mean-voiced rider spat. "When we find her, we'll tie her to a saddle and drag her back to him. He can decide what to do with a lying, thieving runaway." "That's enough. Marcus," the leader snapped. He turned his attention back to Silas. "Well, sorry to have troubled you. If you do happen to see anything, we'll be camped down in the lower canyon for a day or 2. You'll find us there. The reward is real." "I'll keep it in mind," Silas said. Eliza heard the jingle of bridles and the sound of the horses turning. Their hoofbeats, sharp and clear on the ice, began to move away, fading into the vast, cold silence of the mountains. She stayed huddled in her corner, trembling, not daring to move. She didn't know if it was a trick, if one of them had stayed behind to watch the cabin. She listened, straining her ears, until the sound of the horses was completely gone, swallowed by the distance. The silence that returned was more terrifying than the voices had been. She waited. 1 minute, 5, 10. It felt like an eternity. Finally, she heard a single set of hoofbeats returning, slow and deliberate. The sound stopped just outside. The door creaked open. Silas filled the frame, a dark silhouette against the bright, cold morning. He stepped inside and bolted the door behind him. He did not look at her. He leaned the Spencer against the wall and walked to the table. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, his shoulders broad and tense. He had heard it all, the lies, the threats, the casual cruelty. He had heard them say her name. He had heard them speak of Sarah. He had stood before them, a single, silent lie between her and a fate worse than death. Eliza slowly, painfully, pushed herself up. The blanket fell away. She looked at him, at the solid, unmoving line of his back. He had not gone hunting. He had ridden out to meet the wolves at his door, and he had sent them, for now, into the wilderness. But she knew, and she knew that he knew, that they would be back. The hunt was not over. It had just been given a name and a face. The day after the riders came was a day of suffocating silence. The air in the cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, was now thin and sharp, charged with a tension that hummed just beneath the surface of every sound. Silas did not go out. He stayed within the four walls of the cabin, a caged wolf, his presence filling the small space until it felt there was no air left for Eliza to breathe. He was a different man. The quiet stillness he had possessed was gone, replaced by a coiled, watchful energy. He moved with the same economy of motion, but now every action seemed to have a grim weight behind it. He sharpened his axe until the edge was a silver glint of deadly light. He checked the leather straps of his saddlebags, testing the stitching. He packed a small canvas bag with dried meat, hardtack, and a full canteen of water. He did all this without a word, his face a mask of stone. Eliza stayed on her island, the chair at the table, and watched him. The simple act of mending her dress was finished, and she had nothing to do with her hands, which felt clumsy and useless. She was the cause of this. She had brought the wolf to his door, and now he was preparing to meet it. Guilt was a physical thing, a heavy cloak she could not shrug off. He was preparing for a war that was hers alone, a war he had never asked to join. Twice, she opened her mouth to speak, to tell him that she would leave, that he had done more than enough, but the words would not come. What was the use? He had already made his decision when he had looked her in the eye and told her she was not going anywhere. To argue now would be to question the very foundation of the sanctuary he had offered. It would be an insult to the silent promise he was now preparing to keep. They ate their evening meal in the same charged silence. He had stewed some dried vegetables and the last of the bacon. They sat opposite each other at the small table, the firelight flickering between them, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The food was tasteless in Eliza's mouth. Every bite felt like a theft, another resource she was taking from him before the coming storm. He ate with a steady, mechanical focus, his eyes on his plate, but she knew his attention was elsewhere, listening to the sounds of the night, waiting. When they were finished, he took her plate and washed it with his own. Then he turned to the cot. He did not gesture this time. He simply looked at her, his gaze clear and direct, and then looked at the bed. The question was unspoken but clear. She was to sleep there. She was to rest. She lay down on the soft blanket, her body aching with a weariness that was more of the spirit than the flesh. She curled herself into a ball, facing the wall, listening to the sounds of him banking the fire for the night. She heard the familiar scrape of his chair as he moved it to his post by the door. She heard the soft, metallic sound of the Spencer rifle being laid across his lap. Then, only the sound of the fire and his slow, steady breathing, the rhythm of the guardian in the dark. Sleep did not come for a long time. When it finally did, it was a shallow, dream-haunted thing, filled with the sound of hoofbeats and the image of a cold, flat-eyed man with 4 red scratches on his cheek. She woke with a start. The cabin was filled with a cold, gray light. the lonely light of a dawn that has not yet decided to become a day. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It was not the tense, waiting silence of yesterday. It was a deep, profound emptiness. The fire had burned down to a bed of soft, pulsing embers, but it was not dead. It had been carefully banked, a small heart of warmth left to be found. The second thing she noticed was the empty chair. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She sat bolt upright, her eyes scanning the small cabin. The Spencer rifle was gone from its place by the wall. The leather satchel he had packed was gone. She scrambled off the cot, her bare feet recoiling from the cold floor, and limped to the door. It was unbolted. She pushed it open and stared out into the clearing. His horse was gone. The lean-to where he kept it was empty. The tracks of a single horse, shod and purposeful, led away from the cabin, heading not east toward some mythical trap line, but west, back in the direction the riders had come from. He was gone. A wave of desolation so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her. She stumbled back inside and sank to the floor, the rough wood cold against her skin. He had left her. After all of it, the fire, the food, the second blanket, the silent watch he had decided the price was too high. He had ridden away in the dark and left her to her fate. The first emotion was a raw, childish anger. How could he? How could he give her this sliver of hope, this fragile illusion of safety, only to snatch it away? He had made her believe she was not alone, and his departure made the loneliness 1,000 times worse than before. Then came the fear, a vast and bottomless ocean of it. She was alone, truly alone. The men were close, camped in a canyon nearby. They were hunting her, and her protector, the silent, solid man who had stood between her and them, was gone. Tears came then, hot and bitter. They were not tears of grief, but of rage and terror and a despair so complete it felt like a physical death. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth on the cold floor, a small, broken thing in the center of an empty cabin. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned, until there were no tears left. Eventually, the storm of emotion passed, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out calm. She had to move. She had to think. Crying on the floor would not save her. She pushed herself up, using the table for support, and it was then that she saw it. It lay in the center of the table, placed squarely where her plate had been the night before. It was a piece of tanned deer hide, scraped thin and smooth. On it, drawn with a piece of charcoal, was a map. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. It was not a professional map, but a drawing made from memory, stark and simple. It showed the twin peaks that dominated the southern skyline. It showed a crooked line marking a dry riverbed. It showed a cluster of symbols for a pine forest. And it showed a clear, deliberate path, a dotted line that wound its way through the treacherous terrain, avoiding the open spaces, hugging the shadows of the canyons. The path ended at a small, crudely drawn square of buildings, over which a flag flew. Next to it, in thick, blocky letters, was a single word: Sheridan. Fort Sheridan, an army outpost, a place of soldiers, of law, of safety. He hadn't abandoned her. This was not the act of a man running away. This was a plan. This was a message. This was his goodbye. He hadn't left her to her fate. He had drawn her a path to a new one. The anger and confusion began to melt away, replaced by a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. He hadn't run from her. He had ridden out for her. He was buying her time. He had gone to intercept the wolves, to lead them on a false trail, to draw them away from the cabin, away from the path he had laid out for her. Her fingers traced the charcoal line on the soft leather. It was a lifeline, a gift of impossible value, bought with a risk she could not bear to contemplate. As her hand moved across the map, it brushed against something small and solid tucked beneath its edge. It was a pouch, made of the same soft deerskin as the map, no bigger than the palm of her hand, tied shut with a leather thong. It was old, the leather worn smooth with time and handling. With trembling fingers, she untied the knot. She tipped the contents into her hand. 2 small, simple objects fell out, glinting in the pale morning light. They were silver hoops, each with a single, small bead of turquoise. Sarah's earrings. The world tilted on its axis. She stared at them, lying in her palm. So achingly familiar it felt like a phantom limb had just been restored. She had believed they were lost forever, torn from her sister's ear in the struggle, trampled underfoot in the dark cellar. She had mourned them along with Sarah, another small piece of her sister lost to Thorn's violence. But they were not lost. They were here, and there was only one way they could possibly be in this cabin, in this pouch, on this table. He had not just gone to lead the men away. That was not the entirety of his plan. The knowledge struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had gone to their camp, in the dead of night. He had approached the men who were hunting her, the men who had boasted of what they would do to her. He had faced them, not to scatter them, but to confront them. He had gone into the lion's den for this, for her, for the memory of a girl he had never met. He had heard her story, whispered in the dark, and he had understood that her flight was not just for her life, but for the truth of her sister's death. He knew that Thorn would have taken them, a trophy, a memento of his conquest, a final insult, and Silas had decided that she would have them back. He had risked everything, not just for her future, but for her past. He had retrieved the last piece of her sister from the men who had taken her life. It was the most profound act of silent understanding, of fierce, unspoken compassion she had ever known. He had never said her name. He had never offered a word of comfort. But in this single, incredible act of sacrifice, he had told her that he had heard her, that he had seen her, and that her life and the life of the sister she had lost mattered. The tears that came now were different. They were not born of fear or anger. They were tears of a shattering, overwhelming gratitude that was so immense it felt like another form of grief. She sank into the chair, clutching the earrings so tightly they bit into her palm, and laid her head down on the map he had drawn for her. She wept for the man who had ridden out into the dawn, for the impossible, terrible, beautiful gift he had left in his wake. He had never said goodbye, but he had left her a reason to live. For a long time, she did not move. She sat at the table in the cold, gray light of dawn, the deerskin map a testament to his sacrifice, the silver earrings a searing weight in her palm. The map was the voice of reason. It was a path to safety, to a future. It was the gift he had intended for her, the one he had ridden out to purchase with his own blood. To follow it was to honor his sacrifice. To follow it was the sensible thing to do. But the earrings told a different story. They were not about the future. They were about the past. They were about a truth he had deemed worthy of retrieving from the very jaws of the men who had stolen everything from her. The map was a path away from danger. The earrings were proof that he had ridden directly into it. And in that moment, a new and terrible clarity settled over her. What good was a future if the one person who had made it possible was left to die in the wilderness alone? What was safety if it was paid for by the life of the only man who had ever shown her a shred of true, unconditional decency? It was a debt she could not live with. It was a bargain she would not accept. She stood. The movement was no longer hesitant or pained. It was infused with a purpose so sharp and clear it burned away the exhaustion and the fear. She folded the map with a sharp, decisive crease and tucked it into the bodice of her dress. Against her skin. It was his plan, and she would keep it safe. She took the small deerskin pouch and carefully placed Sarah's earrings back inside. Pulling the thong tight, she shoved the pouch deep into the pocket of her dress, a talisman and a promise. She looked around the cabin, her eyes cataloging every detail. This small, rough-hewn space had been her sanctuary. Now it was just a way station. Her path was not the one he had drawn. Her path was the one he had ridden. She had to have a horse. Her mind raced. He had ridden his own buckskin. But the wild sorrel, the one that had fled past the cabin the day before, where had it gone? Had it just kept running, or had it, like her, found a temporary shelter in this rugged landscape? It was a desperate hope, but it was the only one she had. She pulled on a pair of his old, worn-out work boots that she found by the door. They were far too big, but she stuffed the toes with spare rags from his mending kit, and they were a universe of protection compared to her bare feet. She took the heavy sheepskin coat he had worn into the hailstorm. It smelled of him of wood smoke and leather and the cold, clean scent of pine. She wrapped it around herself, a borrowed shield. She found a coil of rope by the door and took it. She had no weapon, no food, nothing but a desperate resolve and a single, clear objective. She stepped out into the clearing. The ice from the hailstorm was melting, dripping from the pines in a steady, rhythmic patter. And there, stark and clear in the damp, dark earth, were the tracks of his horse. Heading west, she began to follow them on foot, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods, praying for a sign. Luck, for the first time in her life, was with her. Not a half-mile from the cabin, in a small, sheltered meadow where a spring trickled from the rocks, stood the sorrel. It was grazing peacefully, its terror from the previous day forgotten. It was a wild thing, not meant for a saddle, but it was a horse. It was a chance. It took her the better part of an hour. She spoke to it in a low, soothing voice, the way she had seen her father speak to frightened animals in a lifetime ago. She moved slowly, patiently, extending a hand, retreating, advancing again. She used a piece of the rope to fashion a crude hackamore, a loop around its nose and over its head. It shied and sidestepped, but it was tired and alone, and it eventually submitted to her gentle, desperate persistence. Climbing onto its bare back was an awkward, painful struggle, but she did it. With no saddle and only a rope for reins, she turned the horse's head and nudged it with her heels, back toward the tracks, back toward Silas. The trail was not hard to follow. Silas had made no effort to hide his passage. He was not sneaking. He was leading. He wanted them to follow him. The tracks led down from the high shelf of the mountain and into a winding, rocky canyon. As she rode, she saw signs of the men who were hunting him. The tracks of their 3 horses joined his, sometimes overlapping. They were on his trail. An hour into her ride, the canyon opened into a wider basin, a bowl of rock and scrub pine. Here, she found the remains of their camp, 3 bedrolls, a dead fire, the scattered debris of a hasty departure, and something else. On the ground, near the fire pit, was a dark, ugly stain, blood, and not far from it, a single set of tracks leading away. Deeper into the canyon, the tracks of a 4th horse, ridden hard. One of them was already gone. Silas had come in the night, as she had suspected. He had faced them. He had taken the earrings, and he had dealt with one of them, but 2 were left. 2 were still hunting him. She pushed the sorrel harder, the horse's rough gait jarring her, every jolt a fresh agony in her feet and a fresh spike of fear in her heart. The tracks grew fresher. The chase was not hours old, it was minutes. She could hear sounds now, carried on the wind the sharp echo of a shout, followed by the deep, booming roar of a heavy-caliber gun, the Colt Dragoon. The canyon narrowed again, the rock walls rising steep and sheer on either side. The path became a treacherous game trail, littered with fallen rock. She rounded a sharp bend, and the sounds of the fight were suddenly close, shockingly loud. Another gunshot, this one sharper, a crack rather than a boom, followed by the whine of a ricochet. She slid from the horse's back, her legs trembling. She tied the rope reins to a stunted juniper and crept forward on foot, her oversized boots silent on the damp ground. She peered around a massive granite boulder and saw them. The scene was a tableau of desperate violence. The trail opened into a small, rocky clearing, a natural dead end. Silas was pinned down behind a fall of rocks, a makeshift barricade. His buckskin horse lay on its side a few yards away, its chest stained with blood. He was alone, on foot. His left arm hung limp at his side. The sleeve of his coat soaked a dark, glistening red from the shoulder down. He was wounded. The two riders were still mounted, using their horses for cover. She recognized the mean-faced one, Marcus. He and the other man were circling, trying to get a clear shot, yelling taunts at their trapped quarry. "Nowhere left to run," Mountain Man Marcus shouted, his voice dripping with venom. "Should have just given us the girl, would have been easier on you." Silas didn't answer. He was leaning heavily against the rock, his face pale and grim. He held the big dragoon in his right hand, waiting, conserving his shots. He fired, the sound a deafening explosion in the confined space. The leader's horse screamed and reared, and the man fought to control it. Marcus used the distraction to spur his own horse forward, trying to get a flanking angle. Eliza's blood ran cold. She saw the tactical reality of the situation in an instant. Silas was wounded, trapped. He could not hold them both off for long. They would wear him down, and they would kill him. She looked around, frantic. There was no other path, no way to circle behind them. She had nothing, no gun, no knife, nothing but her own two hands and the terror that was threatening to paralyze her. She looked at Silas, saw him shift his weight, his face contorted in a silent grimace of pain. He had done this for her. He was dying for her. And in that moment, something inside her broke. It was not a collapse of will, but a shattering of fear. The terror that had been her constant companion for so long was burned away by a white-hot, incandescent rage, a rage for her sister, Sarah, a rage for this silent, decent man who had offered her a kindness she thought no longer existed in the world, a rage against Jebediah Thorne and the cruel, callous men who served him. She took a deep breath. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was not her own. It was a sound torn from the deepest part of her, a raw, ragged shriek of pure, undiluted fury. "Leave him alone!" The scream ripped through the canyon, echoing off the rock walls, a sound so primal and unexpected that it momentarily stopped everything. Both riders jerked their heads in her direction, their eyes wide with shock. Silas's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and horror. He had ridden out to keep the danger away from her, and she had followed it. For a fatal second, the two hunters were completely distracted. The girl, the prize, the entire reason they were here was standing on the trail behind them, screaming like a banshee. The leader was the first to recover, his tactical mind taking over. He started to turn his horse, to bring his weapon to bear on the new, easier target. But it was Marcus who acted first, his mean-spirited rage overriding all sense. This girl was the source of all of it. The chase, the storm, his partner's injury, the death of his horse. Seeing her there, defiant and alive, broke his control. "You!" he snarled, his face a mask of hate. He wrenched his horse's head around, ignoring Silas completely, and spurred the animal directly at her. "I'll shut you up for good." He charged, his pistol raised, his intent clear. He would ride her down. Eliza was frozen. The sheer, animal terror of the charging horse and the murderous fury on the man's face robbing her of all thought. But her scream had done more than distract them. It had given Silas what he needed: an opening, a target, and a threat far more immediate than the one to his own life. He pushed himself off the rock, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. He brought the heavy dragoon up with his one good arm, his stance solid, his aim steady. The world narrowed to the man charging toward the girl. He saw not a man, but a threat that had to be eliminated. He did not hesitate. He did not waver. He fired. The heavy pistol bucked in his hand. The roar of the shot a physical blow. Marcus was thrown from the saddle as if struck by a giant, invisible fist. He landed in a heap on the rocky ground and did not move. His horse, riderless, galloped past Eliza and disappeared down the trail. The leader stared for a fraction of a second at his fallen companion, then at the smoking pistol in Silas's hand, then at the girl standing in the open. He was alone. His odds had changed. Without a word, he yanked his horse's head around and spurred it savagely, retreating the way he had come, his flight as panicked and desperate as the wild sorrel's had been. And then there was silence. A silence broken only by the echo of the gunshot fading down the canyon and the harsh, ragged sound of Eliza's own breathing. She looked from the still form of the man on the ground to Silas, who was now leaning back against the rock, his head bowed, the heavy pistol still clutched in his hand. He had saved her. Again. But this time, she had been there to see it. The echo of the final gunshot faded, leaving a silence in the canyon that was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence that held the sharp, coppery scent of blood and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Eliza stood frozen on the trail, her scream still a raw memory in her throat. She looked at the still, crumpled form of the man named Marcus, then at the distant figure of the fleeing rider, and finally, at Silas. He was still leaning against the rockfall, the heavy Colt dragoon now hanging limply from his right hand. His head was bowed, and the morning sun cast the grim lines of his face into sharp relief. He had won. He had saved her, but the cost was written in the unnatural slump of his shoulders and the dark, widening stain on the sleeve of his coat. The paralysis that had held her broke. She was moving before she made a conscious decision to, her oversized boots stumbling on the loose rock of the trail. She ran to him, her own pain forgotten, her world narrowed to a single, desperate focus. "Silas," she whispered. The first time she had ever said a name that she didn't even know for sure was his. It felt right on her tongue. It felt like his name. He looked up as she approached, his stormy gray eyes clouded with pain and a bone-deep exhaustion. He tried to push himself away from the rock, to stand straight, but a wave of dizziness made him stagger, and he slumped back against the granite, his breath hissing between his teeth. "You're hurt," she said, the words a masterpiece of understatement. The entire left side of his coat was soaked through. "It's nothing," he rasped, the lie as stark and obvious as the blood on the ground. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the canyon. "The other one? He's gone." "He ran," she confirmed, her voice shaking. "He won't be back." "He'll go back to Thorn," Silas said, his voice a low growl of pain and frustration. "He'll tell him where we are." He tried to push himself up again. "We have to move." "No," Eliza said, and the word was firm, resolute. The frightened girl who had stumbled to his door was gone. In her place was a woman who had found her voice in a scream and her purpose in his survival. "You have to let me help you." She gently took the heavy pistol from his unresisting fingers and tucked it into the waistband of her own dress. Then, she reached for the torn sleeve of his coat, with a gentleness that belied the urgency of the moment. She tore the fabric further, exposing the wound beneath. It was a deep, ugly gash high on his shoulder, a long tear where the bullet had grazed the flesh and muscle. It was bleeding freely, the blood welling up dark and thick. "We have to stop this," she said, her mind working with a desperate clarity. She looked around, her eyes landing on the body of his horse. The buckskin had served him faithfully, and it deserved better than this. But its saddlebags might hold what she needed. She ran to the fallen animal, whispering a soft apology, and unbuckled the leather straps. Inside, she found a small roll of clean linen bandages and a flask of whiskey not for drinking, but for cleaning a wound. She brought them back to him. "This is going to hurt," she warned. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes squeezed shut. She uncorked the flask and, without hesitating, poured the raw alcohol directly into the wound. He let out a sharp, guttural cry, his whole body arching in agony, but he did not pull away. Eliza's own stomach clenched in sympathy, but her hands were steady. She took the linen and began to pack the wound, creating a tight pressure bandage to stanch the bleeding. She wrapped the rest of the cloth around his shoulder and chest, binding the arm to his side to keep it immobile. It was a crude, clumsy job, but it was the best she could do. "Can you stand?" she asked when she was finished. He opened his eyes. They were glazed with pain, but the fierce will was still there. "I can stand." With her shoulder braced under his good arm, he pushed himself to his feet. He was a heavy man, and nearly all his weight came down on her. She staggered but held firm. Together, step by agonizing step, they made their way back to where she had left the sorrel. The wild horse looked at them with wide, nervous eyes, but it did not bolt. Getting him onto its back was a near impossible task. He was weak from blood loss, and she was small. It was a clumsy, painful struggle, a grim dance of desperation and grit. Twice, he almost fell, but she held on, her arms straining, her voice a constant, low murmur of encouragement. Finally, with a last, monumental effort, he swung his leg over the horse's bare back and slumped forward, his good hand clutching the animal's mane. She took the rope reins. She did not try to mount behind him. The horse was already agitated, and his weight was all it could manage. She would lead them home, on foot. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, torturous crawl. Eliza walked ahead, her hand firm on the rope, her eyes on the trail. She ignored the screaming pain in her own feet, the ache in her muscles, the profound exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. She focused only on the next step, and the one after that. She could feel Silas's presence behind her, a heavy, wounded weight. Occasionally, he would murmur something she couldn't understand, his voice thick with pain, but he stayed on the horse. He endured. When they finally reached the clearing, the sun was high in the sky. The small, rough-hewn cabin looked like the most beautiful palace she had ever seen. She led the horse to the door and, with the same agonizing slowness, helped him slide from its back. He collapsed against the cabin wall, his face the color of ash. She got him inside and to the narrow cot. For the first time, he was the one to lie down in the place of rest, his big frame seeming to fill the small bed. He was shivering now, a deep, bone-rattling chill setting in. She covered him with both blankets, the coarse one and the soft one, and then she turned to the hearth. The embers he had so carefully banked were still glowing. She knelt before them, just as he had knelt on that first night. She added kindling, blowing gently on the embers until a small flame flickered to life. She added larger pieces of wood, building the fire up until it was a steady, roaring blaze, pushing back the cold and the shadows. She was the keeper of the fire now. For the rest of the day and into the night, she was in constant motion. She fetched water from the spring. She found a small stash of medicinal herbs in his chest yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark for pain, and brewed a bitter, steaming tea, which she coaxed him to drink. She stripped off his blood-soaked coat and shirt and cleaned the wound again, properly this time, her stitches with the mending needle clumsy but firm. She sat by the cot, placing cool, damp cloths on his feverish forehead. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair he had always occupied, the Spencer rifle leaning against it, and she kept watch. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the night, he woke. His eyes were clear, the fever having broken. He looked at her, sitting in the firelight, her face smudged with dirt and etched with exhaustion. "You came back," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "You left me no choice," she answered softly. He closed his eyes then, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips, and he slept. The next morning, she woke in the chair to the sound of bird song. The sun was streaming through the open doorway, flooding the cabin with a warm, golden light. She felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet she had not known since she was a small child. The hunt was over. For now, they were safe. She looked over at the cot. He was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching her, His color was better. The hard lines of his face softened by rest. Her heart gave a small, unfamiliar flutter. She felt a sudden need to do something with her hands. On the table lay the mending kit and a square of clean linen she had used for a bandage. She picked it up, along with the needle and thread. She did not know how to embroider, but she knew how to make a stitch. She began to sew, a simple, running line along the edge of the cloth, her hands still trembling slightly from the ordeal. But her gaze was steady and clear. They sat in a comfortable, companionable silence for a long time. The only sounds the chirping of the birds outside and the soft crackle of the fire. Finally, she looked up from her sewing and met his gaze. "I said I only needed one night," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still morning air. She looked around the cabin, at the rifle, at the neatly stacked firewood, at the satchel he had packed, but you packed for two from the start. He did not answer. Words were not his way, but he held out his good hand to her, a silent invitation. She put down her sewing and went to him. Sitting on the edge of the cot, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and surprisingly gentle. He looked at her, his stormy eyes holding a depth of emotion she was only just beginning to understand. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he lifted her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of it beneath her palm, strong, alive. It was an answer more eloquent than any words he could have spoken. It was a promise. It was an acceptance. It was the beginning. Eliza looked out the open door. The sorrel. Her horse now was tied loosely to a post, grazing peacefully next to a familiar buckskin. Silas's horse had found its way home. Outside, the sun shone, and the world felt new. Two horses, one home. The story, she knew, was not over. It was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really want to support us, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by many more people. We'll see you in the next one.